It seems incredibly appropriate that our next speaker comes from a place called Boys Town. However, this is apparently a boys' town that is very different from that home for indigent boys associated with Father Flanagan, James Cagney, and Mickey Rooney in the famous 1938 movie. My parents hadn't even met in 1938, so I watched it when on what we used to call the reruns. Today, Boys Town is, among other things, a center for neurobehavioral research in children, which Dr. Blair is the director of. He received a doctoral degree in psychology from University College London, and among other places, he has worked at the National Institute of Mental Health before moving on to Boys Town. He is past president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy, as well as the acting vice chair of the Board of Scientific Advisors for the National Courts and Sciences Institute, which educates judges on scientific topics relevant to the courtroom. Dr. Blair's primary research focus, as you will soon hear more about, is on the development of neuro-cognitive systems that, when dysfunctional, give rise to the emergence of mood, anxiety, and externalizing symptoms. So please welcome Dr. James Blair.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much for coming to listen. I will turn my phone on in the hope that I will be reasonably receptive to my time limits, and we shall begin. So yeah, this is the talk plan that I'm proposing. I'm going to talk a little bit about neurocognitive systems that, when they're dysfunctional, increase the risk for aggression. That's going to be the first part of it. Then I'm going to be talking about what's known about environmental influences on the development of these neurocognitive systems. And I'm really, although I say environmental influences, I'm really just going to concentrate on one, which is maltreatment. But actually, I know it came up in one of the questions in the last session about the extent to which we can say that maltreatment is the origin of some of these things. So can we see maltreatment having an impact on those brain systems that we know increase the risk for aggression? And that's, so we're going to attempt to answer that in the second part of the talk, or at least address it. Then we're going to be talking about the extent to which males may be at increased risk for some of these forms of dysfunction. And then finally, I'm going to end up with testosterone because I have to say I didn't really study much on sex differences, so the latter two parts of this talk are mostly from what I've culled from the literature. But I've been bumping into testosterone a lot recently, and it happens to have some quite interesting, I think it's some quite interesting data points with respect to some of the rest of the features. So anyway, that's where we'll end up. Now, one thing before we get on to these systems, I'd like to just note this fundamental difference. It came up a little bit in Adrian's talk as well, this fundamental difference between two forms of violence, two forms of aggression. And that's this difference between instrumental aggression and reactive aggression. Instrumental aggression is the guy that points a gun in your face and says, "Give me your wallet." That's instrumental aggression. They are engaging in a chosen behavior in order to achieve their goals. It's no different from any other form of instrumental behavior. Going to the ATM, putting your card in, getting the money out, taking a job, getting the pay back at the end of the month. Those are all instrumental behaviors. You know, playing the lottery in the hope of winning, all instrumental behaviors. You have a goal, I want money, and you're just picking a behavior to achieve that goal. One potential behavior that we can pick is aggression. But that's very different from reactive aggression. Reactive aggression is a rage-based response, or at least a almost automatic response to a social provocation, to a threat, or to a frustrating event. And it's a rather different neural architecture involved. Best example of reactive aggression you'll ever see in your life is if you look up "man punches snowman" on YouTube. You will see this group of pranksters who were basically doing this prank where one of them was dressed up as a snowman, and they would wait for people to come towards the snowman, And then they'd suddenly orientate this apparently concrete snowman towards the person. Now, the healthy response when you're presented with a threat like that is to freeze, or possibly to back off, to flee. The unhealthy response, as you'll see when you look up man punches snowman on YouTube, is to punch the snowman straight in the face. And if you look at it's a glorious clip. The thing orientates towards him and he just socks it. He's not trying to teach the snowman a lesson. He's not got a goal, which is that is a very naughty snowman, I'm going to punch it. He is reacting extremely strongly to this threat-based stimulus. That is a good example of reactive aggression. It gets more complicated because there are examples of behaviours that we do that aren't simply one or the other, but that is this fundamental dichotomy that's going to be popping up here and there. So, moving from that fundamental dichotomy to these 4 neurocognitive systems that increase the risk for aggression. One of the nice features, some of those will overlap quite nicely with Adrian's talk, some of the nice features of this is that we know so much about these neurocognitive systems. We know it from animal data, we know it from basic human fMRI data, so most of the architectures I'm going to be talking about are really relatively well specified, and so we can actually see when they're perturbed and in particular populations, and if they are perturbed, does that increase the risk for aggression? So these are the 4 systems we're going to talk about. Empathy starting off. Now, when we're talking about empathy here, we're talking about a very narrowly defined version of empathy. This is a response to the distress cues of another individual, their fear, their sadness, their pain. So it's not, an emotional state that may be happening, but the core features we're looking at are what happens to the brain when it is perceiving or responding to this very basic emotional expression stimulus. And the idea is that in healthy individuals, what this does is that it interrupts current behavior if it's salient enough, and it also teaches you that if you're the one that's caused this distress cue, you probably shouldn't do it and do that behavior in the future, or at least it should give a negative valence to the action that you've either just committed or you've seen committed by another individual. It's, Adrian was talking about stimulus reinforcement learning. This is a form of stimulus reinforcement learning, though in this case the reinforcement is this aversive social cue, the distress cue of another individual. So this is this very narrowly defined version of empathy. And basically, you get we can specify a pretty nicely specified set of regions that are critical for this. We have to see the stimulus, so you've got to get visual cortex, temporal cortex, important for processing faces, and then the amygdala that had a salient role in Adrian's talk. Amygdala is absolutely critical for generating an emotional response to the distress of other individuals, and it's absolutely critical for learning about actions or the negative valence of actions that are being associated with this distress of other individuals. That amygdala has direct connections down to the hypothalamus and periaqueductal brain. That's these circuitries that derive that very basic response to threat or these social cues and will allow the interruption of behavior. They'll generate a freeze response, at least if they're activated at a reasonable level. We then see these areas of medial frontal cortex that Adrian was also mentioning. These are critical areas for actually representing emotional information to the rest of the brain, so the brain knows what it's feeling, basically, and can make decisions based around valence information. Anterior insula is in there as well, but it's not depicted on this particular picture. And then there are other regions, like posterior cingulate, that again was mentioned by Adrian, and moving into parietal cortex and lateral frontal, that are more important in orienting your attention towards this distress cue stimulus. So a selection of brain areas that do specific roles. Obviously, they're doing these roles in integration with each other, so it's a little bit incorrect to say they're doing specific roles because they're so highly interactive, but just for the purposes of making life easy to parse, that's what I'm trying to do. So, what about callous-unemotional traits? Callous-unemotional traits are this specific set of features. It's now called low pro-social emotions within DSM-5. Specific emotional features that are core in psychopathy that Adrian was talking to, and that are marked by reduced guilt and reduced empathy, as well as deficient affect and a lack of remorse or guilt. These individuals are particularly notable, as children with conduct disorder are particularly notable because they're a massively increased risk for aggression generally, and they're a particularly massively increased risk for instrumental aggression. If an individual has engaged in, shows callous-unemotional traits, they're much more likely to be using aggression to meet their goals. So, the idea will be, if you don't respond appropriately to the distress cues of other individuals, you don't care as much about harming other individuals. And if you don't care as much about harming other individuals, you're much more able to do actions that will harm other individuals to achieve your goals. So that's the basic idea. If you've got this fundamental empathy deficit, will that manifest in problems in this circuitry and be associated with an increased risk for instrumental aggression? And that's what we see. So this is a study we did some time back, back at NIMH, showing that kids with conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and callous-unemotional traits showed a markedly reduced response within the amygdala and connected structures to the distress of other individuals, in this case, fear faces. And basically, the morphed images, you see different images at each individual time, so you can see which areas ramp up the more intense the fear face was, and the amygdala is one of those areas that healthy individuals, children with ADHD, show nice ramping up when you're getting a more empathy-inducing expression, but that's not shown in kids with callous-unemotional traits. And this has been replicated quite consistently in the child data, and a rather nice study that I'm going to actually show you by a woman called Lozia and one of my ex-postdocs, Abigail Marsh, showing that the relationship between callous-unemotional traits and instrumental goal-directed behavior was mediated by the emotional responsiveness, the amygdala responsiveness to the distress of other individuals. So again, tightly linking this fundamental problem in responding to distress to this marked issues with aggression, and particularly with instrumental aggression. Now, one thing I didn't mention, although it came up again a bit with Adrian's talk, the amygdala and all those connected structures are not just critical for responding to the distress of other individuals, they're responsive to other negative stimuli, threat stimuli far more generally. So, sharks and spiders and things that loom towards you, all the classic threat stimuli, these regions are responsive to as well. And so what we were looking at, this is one of the nice things we're going to work with at Boys Town, we could look at what neural risk factors are there for increased aggression risk within the first 90 days that a child is at Boys Town. This is when the most likely the child is to be aggressive. So ignoring the historical data entirely, and just looking the extent to which we can actually predict, is a child going to be aggressive in those first 90 days? And what you see was that this is this looming paradigm. These pictures seem to loom towards you or recede from you. So we're looking at looming threats. And what we see is that the weaker your response to looming threats, the greater the number of aggressive episodes you showed in your time at, in the first 90 days that you were at Boys Town. There's about 90 participants in this study. So, first system, empathy. Very relatively well characterized architecture from a lot of work with healthy individuals, and we can see that architecture just not working well in a group of highly aggressive individuals, those with callous-unemotional traits, and it's particularly associated with instrumental goal-directed aggression. Moving on to another architecture, this acute threat response. This is just a subset of those systems we were talking about before. The amygdala, hypothalamus, PAG. And the reason why we're talking about this subset is because this subset of brain regions is the subset that controls or that mediates your response when you're in a highly threatening circumstance. So whether you freeze, like with that snowman, whether you freeze or whether you back off and flee, or whether you reactively aggress. This is the architecture that controls that. We've done lots and lots of work from animal work studies, and there's a fair bit now of human imaging studies are backing that up as well. So this basic architecture is, and the more that this architecture responds, the stronger the response this architecture shows, the more you're likely to be running rather than freezing, or fighting rather than freezing, or rather than running, if you're particularly strongly responsive. So if this architecture is overly responsive, not underly responsive, but overly responsive, you're selectively likely to have an increased risk for reactive aggression. You'll lash out rather than freeze or flee. The guy who punches the snowman, my strong suggestion would be that his architecture is highly responsive. I obviously don't have any data on him, I don't know, but that would be the suggestion. One of the tasks we've got, I'm not going to go into the details of any of these tasks, I could definitely run people through the tasks. The only thing really to concentrate with this one right now is that it involves showing images of threat and neutral stimuli. And what you see in a selection of kids with conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, you've got healthy kids on the far left and then two groups of kids with conduct disorder. The one in the middle actually has conduct disorder, but they don't have callous-unemotional traits. They have low callous-unemotional traits. So they're the group of conduct disorder who don't have callous-unemotional traits. And then the far right is the group with callous-unemotional traits. And as you can see, there's a big difference. It's not that all kids with conduct disorder have this fundamental empathy threat problem and show a reduced response to distress, a reduced response to threat. They exist, that's that group on the far right. But there's a secondary group of kids with conduct disorder who show the exact opposite, who show a heightened response to threat, a heightened response to the distress of other individuals. So it makes life particularly complicated. When you're dealing with a child with conduct disorder, they're not all the same. They don't have all the same neurobiological problem. Some of them have this empathic problem. Some of them have actually the opposite, an emotional lability problem. And of course, if these sort of data are correct, and there's a lot of data to support them, particularly with kids now, both from my lab but other people's labs across the world, then you're in a situation where you cannot give the same intervention to all kids with conduct disorder. Any intervention with for conduct disorder that's based around downplaying emotional responsiveness might really be good for the kids that are emotionally labile, the kids that are highly reactive aggressive. Absolutely waste of time with the kids who are high callous-unemotional traits, because, or at least the kids that have these fundamental emotional problems, because it's just not the problem that they face. If you have a group of kids with this emotional problem, under-responsive emotional problem, and you're trying desperately to boost that emotional responsiveness up, that may work with them. But it's a really lousy idea to do with those kids who are already emotionally labile. You're just going to make them worse. So an indication of where the neurobiology might go with respect to intervention impact. So, two systems, very different systems in the sense that there's one with underly responsive, increasing risk, having very, very general increased risk effects, and one more specific, increased responsive, having specific risks for emotional lability and reactive aggression. So, moving on to response control. And again, very nicely, this is a review from a few years back by a guy called Aaron, very nicely, it's been extremely worked through what the neural architecture, both with animal data and with human data, although this is primarily human data that generated this review, what the neural architecture that is involved in allowing you to control your behavior, to engage in what's called response inhibition, to inhibit prepotent responses. This is circuitry that's the pre-SMA, that's dorsal medial region in the middle, as well as inferior frontal and anterior insular cortex, and then striatum comes into play as well, although it's not so good, isn't it, depicted in this image. This is a massively interconnected set of systems, critical for engaging in response inhibition. Lesions in this area and the individual will engage in impulsivity. Taking this task again, we actually have two things here with this task. We have the emotional response, but we also have dealing with the congruent versus incongruent number arrays. So you actually in the task had to count how many numbers and press the button according to the number of numbers on the screen in that interval between the emotional images. And you have easy trials where 3 3s is a congruent trial, the number to count is the same as the number you read, and incongruent trials, which are more difficult trials, 4 5s, where the number that you read, 5, is different from the number that you count, 4. So, you know. And here, if you look at problems in task-based trials, you see profound problems, again, in kids with CD relative to healthy kids. And what's notable here is this is seen irrespective of the kid's CU level. So it doesn't matter how callous unemotional traits, how high a level of callous unemotional traits the kid with conduct disorder shows, that has no predictive power for the level of response inhibition problems they have. And kids with low callous-unemotional traits and kids with high callous-unemotional traits within the category of kids that have CD are at increased risk for showing these response inhibition problems or failing to recruit this architecture. In this case, the anterior insula. Dorsal medial are also involved, but to a lesser extent. They're compromised in their ability to recruit these regions, irrespective of the CU traits. But one thing on top of that to note is it doesn't seem to be a particular risk factor for aggression. We find consistently so far, when you specifically look at aggression, no relationship, or no strong relationship at least, between level of response inhibition architecture recruitment, or ability to recruit those areas, and your severity of aggression symptoms. But what we do see is a very strong relationship between ability to recruit those regions and the level of ADHD symptomatology is shown. In fact, that's on the far right there. Even though this group was selected for having CD relative to being healthy, even though that was the selection criteria, we didn't bother, we didn't care whether they had ADHD or not. There was no relationship between severity of CD, severity of aggression, and this recruitment about this architecture, but a very strong relationship between the ability to recruit this architecture and ADHD symptomatology. The last of these I'm going to very briefly talk about is this reinforcement-based decision-making architecture. There's a nice, this is a nice review back in 2014. It's another well-worked-through neural architecture involved in reinforcement-based decision-making that we've got from animal data as well as human data. The important regions coming up again here are these ventral medial or frontal regions, as well as striatum that just got mentioned a short time before by Adrian. Here actually is the only thing, in fact we lay out two possibilities here, that it might be an excessive striatal response, or it might be a reduced striatal response. Adrian was strongly campaigning for the idea of an increased striatal response, being the risk factor for antisocial behaviour, but that is only one possibility, and in fact that's not the possibility that we see in the KID data. This is not to say that Buchholz's data was wrong. The difference though is that Buchholz's data was collected in healthy individuals. There's a very reliable literature out there from the ADHD literature showing that impulsivity, striatal responding, the stronger your striatal responding, if you're healthy, the more impulsive you show, more impulsive behavior you show. But it's relatively healthy impulsivity. So we could probably scan everybody in this room, look at striatal responsiveness, and we would see that the individuals in this room who like skydiving and, I don't know, wild and crazy stuff, those show a really strong striatal response. On the other hand, those individuals who like a much more quiet existence, going hiking, reading a book, whatever, those individuals will show a weaker striatal response. But if you get into the clinical populations, if you get into populations with ADHD and our data with CD, under those circumstances, so if you were all individuals with CD or ADHD, the sicker that you were, the less striatal response you were showing to reward. And this, the ADHD findings are extremely robust. It's a meta-analytic review from now 3 or 4 years ago, showing that again, you get this U-shaped curve. Impulsiveness in healthy individuals, that's associated with increased striatal response. Impulsiveness in patients, that's associated with decreased striatal response. What I would argue, what's going on here, what we're picking up is a fundamental failure in systems that are necessary for good reinforcement-based decision-making. The striatum is just one of these components. These are a whole bunch of other components. These regions are critical for making you make good decisions. If you can't represent the value of something, if you can't represent how good or bad it is, you're going to make really lousy decisions. And if you make lousy decisions, you're not going to meet your goals effectively. And if you don't meet your goals effectively, you're going to be frustrated and aggressive accordingly. And so it's a fundamental failure in the workings of this architecture rather than the superiority of a reward response, I would argue. This is about the only thing I would disagree with Adrian about, but other than that, we're on the same page. I'm hoping he's going to come around, so anyway, that's another talk for another day. So one of the tasks we use is passive avoidance. It's a very simple task. You have to respond whether some of the stimuli are good, some of the stimuli are bad. If you respond to the good stimuli, you're more often than not going to get reward. If you respond to the bad stimuli, you're more often than not going to get punishment, the loss of money, the gain of money, and you're just looking at architectures involved in the decision-making process. I'm not going to get into the details at all. I mentioned this is the classic finding with this task. If this task has existed since 1980, it's an extremely robust result showing that individuals with psychopathy, individuals with high levels of antisocial behavior show pronounced impairment on this task. They keep on picking or are more likely to pick the bad stimuli than healthy individuals. They make lousy decisions. And when we looked at this task, we saw problems in striatum, we saw problems in anterior insula, we saw problems in ventromedial. This is just one of the anterior insula findings, just showing very pervasive problems in this decision-making architecture in these kids with CD. Now again, I should note, this is not a CU-specific effect. This is a CD-specific effect. It's something associated with more general antisocial behavior, not with a problem specifically in, with callous-unemotional traits. So this is the first summary, and to get us all placed, and hopefully I'm going to speed up from now on, although I'm probably getting a bit too fast already, showing that these four architectures and some of the symptom sets associated with it. Empathy, callous-unemotional traits, instrumental aggression. Acute threat response, irritability, reactive aggression. Response control, impulsiveness generally, probably exacerbating other problems if you haven't had those other problems as well. And then reinforcement-based decision-making problems do also seem to be linked with aggression, but a much more general, non-specific way. We then get into the complicated cases. You're the person that's turned away from the bar where he wants to meet somebody by the bouncer, really, really angry about it, goes home, grabs his shotgun, comes back, shoots the bouncer. Clearly instrumental. He had a plan. He wanted to kill the bouncer. He used a goal. He used a mechanism to achieve that goal, picking up the shotgun. But massively reactive as well, in the sense he was having this rage from being frustrated in his goal to So the problem is with the instrumental-reactive split is there are many cases where we've got a combination of the architecture going on. And so we have that basic threat architecture, amygdala, hypothalamus, PAG, and it's being modulated by core frontal regions, which gets sort of tied in with some of what Adrian was talking, these sort of ventral medial, and that came in quite nicely with this reactive population from way back when, as well as dorsal medial regions as well. And what you see, I won't even have time to go through the task, but it's basically you are offering money to another person in the game, and they can accept it, or they can punish you. They can retaliate for what a lousy job of sharing the $20. So if they've kept $18 for themselves and only giving you $2, you can retaliate by spending your own money to take their money away. So it's an indirect measure of reactive aggression, but it's a retaliatory response. And you see in the architectures for that retaliatory response, those systems that I've just backed out before, but in the groups with conduct disorder, I pressed the wrong button, in the groups with conduct disorder, you see those groups with the highly reactive form, the CU minus group, they show the heightened amygdala and the heightened PAG. The group with CU traits don't show any profound problems there, but when you get onto ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the connections between ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, both groups of kids with CD, profoundly compromised. This decision-making architecture is messed up. Ventral medial prefrontal cortex in particular is messed up in many of the kids with CD, and the idea is if that system is messed up, you will not select correctly what response you should do. You won't code the fact it's a lousy idea to take away all the other person's money, because although I didn't make any money or much money on this turn, I'm going to make even less if I spend my money to hurt the other person. So, that's the first part all done. Outline what is known about the environmental influences, maltreatment on these systems. Again, linking in with the question that Adrian had. That's that looming task where the stimuli comes straight towards you, a threat-based task. And what we see, I'm just concentrating on sexual abuse here, although the findings they're just particularly strong with respect to sexual abuse. Sexual abuse in the data that we're getting is a far more toxic environmental event than any other form of maltreatment that we're indexing. Far more toxic than physical abuse, than emotional abuse, than physical or emotional neglect, at least within the data set, within the ranges of these problems that we're seeing. Well, now we see pretty severe physical, emotional abuse, but there are, I mean, there's like a Romanian study of neglect. The kids there were obviously massively more neglected than the sample we're dealing with here. And what we see is a striking increase in responsiveness to threat. So it's not that this maltreatment is associated with anything like callous-unemotional traits, but it certainly is a potential risk factor for that acute threat response, being overly responsive, being too responsive to threat. It gets hideously complicated. Oh, blast. I keep on pressing the wrong button. It gets hideously complicated because that association between callous-unemotional traits and weak amygdala responding is only shown in those kids who haven't suffered significant maltreatment beforehand. For some reason, kids who've suffered significant levels of maltreatment, some of those kids present as if they're showing high levels of callous-unemotional traits, even though neurobiologically they are showing the exact opposite problem. They're showing a heightened amygdala response. Now, the heightened amygdala response is obviously highly consistent with what we know about the impact of maltreatment is, but it's very strange to see that we can see something that's mimicking exactly the same behavioral profile, callous-unemotional traits, but being mimicked by completely different neurobiological underpinnings in a fraction who've suffered this high trauma. Response control, we can look at the ability to do some of those task-based trials on this paradigm, and again, much of this architecture, at least some of this basic motor architecture, is profoundly compromised in the individuals who've suffered maltreatment, particularly individuals who've suffered some form of abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, are profoundly compromised in the ability to recruit regions engaged in response control. And here is a paper that we did in collaboration with Essie Weiding's group at the Institute of Psychiatry, looking at reinforcement-based decision-making, just showing you some of the ventromedial results, but there are also striatal results as well. Again, maltreatment profoundly compromises your ability to engage in reinforcement-based decision-making. So if we summarize back to those four systems, no, maltreatment does not appear to give rise to an empathy problem, at least in the extent of when we define empathy problem neurobiologically. If we're looking at callous-unemotional traits, everything gets a bit more complicated. But if we're looking at amygdala responsiveness, no. Maltreatment doesn't seem to have that impact, at least in the data that we're getting. But it does increase acute threat response, it does increase threat responding generally, it does mess up response control, and it does seem to profoundly compromise reinforcement-based decision-making. So could maltreatment be increasing the risk for aggression? Without a shadow of a doubt. It might be more specific, more general, rather than the callous-unemotional form, but it's definitely is likely to be associated with profound problems. So, we're finally getting on to stuff that's actually why you very kindly invited me to come. And I keep on pressing the button with almost impulsive glee, so there we go. Are males at increased risk for at least some of these forms of dysfunction? Now, I have to say, I did a little review of the literature to try and answer this question. Given that we do have these architectures, so can we see these architectures messed up with males versus females or equivalent or whatever? The data it was not an easy task, I thought. But I thought I was going to get some pretty clear evidence for increased emotional responsiveness in women relative, or males and females relative to males. But there wasn't actually such great data. I found a couple of studies, and this is an oldish study from Feldman Barrett's group that indeed did report that at least maintenance of emotional responding was greater in females rather than males. But there wasn't the consistency that one might have expected. Probably because if there is a male-female difference in these neurocognitive systems, I'm not going to be surprised if there is, but if there is, it's probably relatively weak. The thing though, of course, is if it is, and therefore it's very difficult to see in imaging studies, which often are pretty small end studies. But if there is a weak effect, given that we're talking about 50% of the population, that can still have a massive effect on increasing aggression risk. Getting back to that instrumental-reactive, there's a rather nice paper again. I rather like to put A because I rather like the authors and their friends, so you always like to support friends, so there you go. And because I thought the findings were quite interesting, because they basically saw the same architecture that we see as dysfunctional, they also see that it was dysfunctional. And they particularly showed that those forms of dysfunction were more common in males rather than females. So they showed that at least within this sample, having problems in the amygdala response, the increased amygdala response, and again, this is somewhat inconsistent with Feldman-Barrett, but in this case, the males were showing an increased response in provocation, and they were showing this very profound compromised response within this ventral medial region that should be downregulated. So it could be that they're showing a heightened amygdala because of this failure in downregulating. Again, it was only 20 and 20. Should you really take it seriously? I don't know. But again, it was obviously something that was relevant potentially. So maybe being male reduces your empathic possibility. Maybe that's why one of the reasons why males are markedly increased for instrumental aggression, and that whole profile of things that Paul was showing us before, murder and the rest of it, high aggression bias, male bias. Maybe there is an effect there, but again, the data is not screaming. I mean, it doesn't scream out, but again, it's probably a small-scale effect. And maybe in this reinforcement-based decision architecture, although there's considerable debate about that. I am much more confident about this, though. Much more confident about this. Now, there's a slight problem here. I'm going to be talking about testosterone, which is clearly not something that is an early thing. It's clearly something that we talk about with puberty, not with the little kiddies. But actually, I think and in fact, actually, I know on your slide you were showing pre-10 your increased risk for problems for males versus females, although many of those problems you showed were things like autism and schizophrenia and psychosis that were things beyond this. So I'd still like to believe that one of the major reasons why males are so much more aggressive than females does relate directly to testosterone. That's not my data, so I'm going to be supporting other people's data now. So I can say I'm relatively unbiased in this, other than I happen to embrace the idea with some glee. But I think certainly I found it of interest. So hopefully you will too. Now, we know there's a really great set of data showing that castration does indeed have these profoundly compromising effects on male aggression. Very dramatic effects. But what's noticeable, that increases in testosterone do increase aggression, but only up to the level that the person was likely to show before they were testosterone was temporarily removed. Unless the dose is ridiculously high, which doesn't really apply to most human interactions. So in other words, testosterone is not so clear from this first set of data. It is a necessity, or at least it's an important prerequisite, massively, if you don't have it, your risk for regression is massively low. But it's not that it's a dose-dependent effect. The more testosterone effect you have, the more aggressive. That's clearly not the case. And what's quite interesting about testosterone is testosterone, you get these bursts of what you do as a male, you get these bursts, and you do to a weaker extent than females, but in males you get these huge bursts of testosterone after specific events, not just in the ability in a provocation circumstance, but also in rewarding circumstances, or even if you happen to see a potentially receptive partner. And this is all mice stuff, so it's not that I don't think anybody's done any study like that in humans, but this is mice data showing that those types of variables, all of those types of variables, not just a fighting thing, it seems to a bunch of different highly important social stimuli, then you get these elevated testosterone responses. And I haven't got time to go through all the data that's out there. At least I don't think I've got time. Probably do now. No, actually, I'm going to come in on time. Woohoo! So, I'm not going to go through all this data, but this is the model that Justin Carey has been using, and there are other people out there with relatively similar models, but it's a very nice, clear way of looking at it. Showing that when you get testosterone surges to a variety of circumstances, to threat, to reward, but generally to fitness-based challenges or opportunities. So if you're in a situation where your behavior might determine the chance of being able to carry on your genes, you're likely to increase your testosterone level. You get a testosterone surge. Now, what the idea is that this doesn't, just because you've got testosterone sloshing around, this doesn't make you aggressive. All it does is it makes the selection of those behavioral responses that you have primed up in order to meet your fitness-oriented goals. Those behaviors being primed up, they're primed up by the testosterone, so you're more likely, all other things being equal, to fire them off. So in other words, Adrian is a very nice man. He's in a sudden aggressive situation, his testosterone system bursts into flame, but Adrian doesn't look for the beer glass. Adrian looks for a charming response to de-escalate the situation and make the person calm down and generally be happy, and then they can all go on and carry on drinking. That is the response that's been primed up in an individual who's not primed up for aggression. Me, I'm a nasty person. They knock into me, I grab a beer glass, I gouge them, all sorts of horror stuff. I mean, this is not true, please don't arrest me afterwards, I'm just making this up. But again, what's primed up is based around your history of learnt behaviours to deal with in these situations. It's not that it makes you go out and be aggressive, it makes you that if you have behaviours ready for this situation, you will fire them off more likely, you're more likely to fire them off. But what those behaviours are, that's the thing that's individual differences. And here we have some rather nice data, this is from Carre's lab, showing that it's not that exogenous testosterone increases aggressive behaviour in everybody. It only increases, don't worry, I'm definitely done. It increases behaviour only in those people who were premorbidly ready to be aggressive. And so if we go back to our summaries now, this is what I say, I'm almost done. Summary, these are these circuitry that I would argue increase the risk for different forms of aggression and different types of symptom sets. Maltreatment is hitting at least 3 of them in a pretty clear fashion. Being male may hit 2 of them, but the data, as I said, will need to be worked through, and it's not something I concentrate on. But what testosterone does, I'm going to argue that why males, particularly males in teenage and onwards, are particularly aggressive, is indeed likely to be related to testosterone. It's not a direct effect, it's because of this role in potentiating or protecting and enhancing fitness. And the idea is that the forms of dysfunction associated with aggression may not be more common in males than females. Those 4 forms of neuro-cognitive dysfunction may or may not be more common in males than females. The data seems to be pretty, not that clear to me, although perhaps some of the other speakers will show data that's much more clear. But for me, it was not so clear when I was reading through. But the idea would be that testosterone facilitates that expression. And because men have the testosterone surges much more strongly than women do, that's why males are so much more aggressive, because it's all dependent on how much problem they had before, and then how that problem suddenly gets much more likely to be expressed because of the impact of testosterone. And there's my little thing. So increased acute threat response, dysfunctional ventral medial prefrontal cortex modulation. That will increase the risk for retaliatory aggression. If you don't have those sorts of problems, you're very unlikely to be retaliatory, unless the threat is really strong or the provocation is really strong. And testosterone will potentiate that threat based around how much you're ready to release that behaviour anyway. And that's my end of my talk, so hopefully that was entertaining. Any questions? Or have I so far gone so fast that everybody's thinking, oh my goodness, I need some lunch? Oh no, I think it's still not a talk. No, you can't have any lunch.
James, here. Nothing about there's nothing in this about the organizational role of testosterone, the prenatal, perinatal.
Yeah. I mean, not because, bear in mind, this testosterone stuff is not my work. I mean, there are variables that we know that, and certainly I didn't, obviously the people who are doing this are obviously one of the manipulations they use are testosterone administrations from one form or another. And they can't obviously do that with little kiddies. So those are the data I was really concentrating on. don't know of any data suggesting that testosterone in, in utero, or in that whole during that period, that's affecting these particular neurocognitive systems. Let's not say that it isn't. I just don't know of those data, and so I can't. I don't know. I mean, the fact though is testosterone can have a whole bunch of other effects, not least of which it helps muscular growth. And one of the things, but one of the reasons why males are going to be more aggressive is because not only are they more likely to learn based around, people learn to be aggressive based around this architecture and the architectural problems, but obviously if you win being aggressive, you're more likely to be aggressive in the future. You'll get those some learning responses as well. And being big is more easy to win. But I don't know. I really could not answer that. Again, from the story that's being told here, it's this facilitation story. The testosterone is then having organizational systems, but again, which systems are being organized and how, I really wouldn't know.
And what about things like the effect, the prenatal testosterone effect on other neurotransmission systems? Is there known?
It's not that I don't know whether it's not known. I just my concentration work is on those neurocognitive systems. I don't really consider too much sex differences. I haven't really considered testosterone really before this talk, or only just as a vapor. So I know what is going to be interesting is a big project that's been set up by NIDA particularly at the moment. It's focused around maternal opioid use, but they're going to be looking at kids that are, or pregnant mothers at 6 months, and then following the kids up over the first 10 years of life. And I'm sure that some of those projects are going to be indexing hormonal impacts as well. So some of these may properly be answered, and that's a big N, 10,000 people study, so that will have the data to really tell us. And as far as I know, the Imogen, either the Imogen and the, I couldn't see big sex different results from the Imogen, 1,000-person study, and I don't know whether anybody's looked at it with the new 10 years plus studies that's been going on at the moment. So.
It's a point of information for Paul's question. Paul, you're asking about prenatal testosterone and aggression. There is actually a bit of a literature on this. It sounds really hokey, but if you divide the length of the second digit by the fourth digit, the ring finger, that gives you a handle on level of exposure prenatally to testosterone. And that index has been correlated with aggression down the road, and there is a link. The more testosterone exposure prenatally, the higher the aggression down the road. The effect size is small. Meta-analysis says it is there, but overall a small effect size, currency of about 0.1.
Yeah, the trouble is we don't really know how the effect, again, we need to know whether it's a neurocognitive impact, or whether it's a size impact, or whether it's something else entirely. It could be all, that's the story. There is definitely data. I've seen data saying that prenatal testosterone abnormalities are associated with increased aggression risk, but how that effect is going has not been spelled out that I can see whatsoever. Is it through these, having an impact on these neurocognitive systems? Maybe, maybe not. I didn't see any data that would, nobody's really investigated it. Or is it something else? Is it a size effect? Is it something else entirely? We just don't know. So I'm not disputing the potential for an early testosterone effect, but again, and partly because it's so weak, is what's actually driving it. Oh, I have a question.
I don't know that there's been any studies that look at this, but it's a question that frequently occurs to me, and that is the level of expendability that men experience, in particular men, but women also, in terms of, for example, certainly evolutionary history would make men the more expendable of the two between males and females. And that expendability, in my mind, could have a lot of consequences in terms of how men experience themselves and the capability of bondedness or empathic connectedness So aggression, I would think, would come with the experience of expendability, whether or not that's totally evolutionary, but it would impact some men perhaps more than others. I guess I'm wondering, have there been any studies that look at that?
I think it'd be difficult to look directly at what you're looking at, expendability. It's difficult to quantify how that would be other than just being male. And, you're completely right. Obviously, to make babies, you need, the more women, the more babies you can make. That's not the same for the more men, necessarily, as long as, So I can see the expendability argument. But again, it's not quite sure. It could be, we sort of heard about the weakness, it could be that males are more prone to development, mutations that are detrimental because of there's some sort of strange gene effect that allows mutations more often in males than females because of these sort of expendable. I don't know anything like that. Well, literally, that's not saying it doesn't exist, I just don't know anything like that. Do I think that sort of thing, again, would necessarily, we've got nothing that would say about those neurocognitive systems, so yeah, I don't know, it's a possibility. But I don't think it would be, it's not a very empirically tractable possibility to go after.
Well, I was only thinking in terms of expendability and reproduction directly, but what if we looked at men who were more willing to go into the military, for example, versus men who would be less prone in that area?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that again, it's not clear that they would regard themselves as more expendable just for going to the military. I would argue they probably wouldn't. So I don't know whether that would be the right way of going. Data on, I have to say, I thought we did one very small study, we never published it, but one very small study looking at special forces individuals, because I assumed those individuals would be empathically challenged simply because of the job that they were doing. That did not appear to be the case at all. It was a small end sample, so maybe it's not true and all the rest of it. We found no group differences at all in empathic responding. What we did find very profound differences in emotional regulatory circuitry. And so maybe that is really what marks out somebody who's a particularly efficient soldier, because they're so good at dealing with these highly threat environments in order to keep on functioning. But that's the closest I can get to an answer to your question, which is somewhat not that close.
Okay.
James?
Could I just
Can
I just add a response to that comment? Because I think the evolutionary response to why males would be that males have to compete for mates. And that inter-male competition rewards capacity to physically as well as psychologically outmaneuver your mates. And then there may even be the fact that females differentially or in the past are selected for mates who can prevail in physical conflicts, so that we end up developing males who are more skilled at aggressive behavior. So that would be a simple answer. It doesn't get at the issue that you're getting at of individual differences, be it for neuro-cognitive or other reasons, but it's just a general sex difference in terms of mating strategies.
And actually, to follow on one thing I didn't mention at all, we do know from a large amount of mammalian literature that there are, that basic acute threat response architecture that I was mapping out, a very similar architecture actually mediates a specific aggressive response to other males in sexually competitive environments, the inter-male aggression. That definitely exists in other males. Nobody's really got a good handle on it with humans, but it definitely, other mammals. It would be amazing if we don't have something similar, given all other mammals, at least those that have been studied, appear to have it. But, and again, that's almost, it will be one of those architectures that will be primed up by testosterone surges. So yes, I completely agree. Yep.
I think there's two parts to this, but I'm interested in having clinically worked with kids, and the understanding of cause and effect seems to be a really big issue for a lot of children. And when you mentioned poor choices, so I'm thinking to myself, how closely related is that to intelligence? And I mean that in the broadest sense, emotional or IQ. It could be a lot of, I'm not going to, but I'm just trying to to see if that
Oh
is
yeah, so
something
can I
that
answer that
you...
bit? Can I answer that bit first? Because that's
Yes.
and then I might get stuck on the second part, so at least I can answer the first part reasonably.
Okay.
So yeah, no, we know the neural architecture for intelligence. There is a very, it's a sort of working memory, lateral frontal, parietal cortex. None of that architecture is anything resembling what we're talking about here. I mean, there's vague overlaps here and there, but nothing, and in the studies that I do, the groups are either matched for IQ, or we covary out the impact of IQ, or we look at the impact of IQ as well as covariant out and show that it's a completely different architecture from the architecture we're looking at. So I can be totally and utterly confident that IQ is not a major player here. The decision-making architecture we're talking about is separate from that architecture that allows you to be fast at processing rather than slow at processing, or have those do well on those IQ tasks. Emotional intelligence is a bit of a weird, because emotional intelligence is sort of empathy, and so I'm going to be a bit more wishy-washy in my response to that answer, because it's difficult to really disentangle it from some of the stuff we're talking about. And in fact, I think the real core bits of emotional intelligence are what empathic responding beyond just that response to distress cues, but are empathic responding. So there would be much more of an overlap. But that would be because you're really measuring the same thing when you're measuring emotional intelligence as empathic responding, because they're the same neural architectures doing the job. But I'll just answer your second question. I've been told to wrap up. So do you want to say the second question? I will, but it better be short, because otherwise someone's going to
Just
stop me.
the idea of being able to understand cause and effect seems to be a big thing. I wonder where that fits in.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, we could say all of these, just like Adrian mentioned, all of these things could actually be all effect of some other cause. The aggression giving rise to the brain level problems. I don't think that's the case, and some of the reasons for not thinking that case, that predictive study, when I showed you when we scanned the people when they came into Boys Town at time 1 and then looked at their aggression over the next 90 days, that aggression over the next 90 days was clearly not causing their scan at time 1, although it could have been the prior effect, so it's not a best bit of data, but it's the beginning. The really core bits of data, treatment. If we can show treatment takes down those signals, gets them back into a healthy range, and when you're doing that, you then show an individual who's less aggressive, then the cause-effect argument is gone. But we haven't done that yet. We're obviously I scan the kids as they come into Boys Town, I scan them 9 months later if they leave. Some of them are showing good, strong, well, a lot of them are showing good, strong treatment effects. We should be able to pick up some of these things. I do not have the data to show you today. I do have the data showing, actually, not with me, and I'm sorry, but the sexual abuse data is so depressing because it was such a massive effect over and above anything else. But what we do see, at least in the small end sample we have, time 1, time 2, Boys Town, time 1, time 2, that highly overly responsive response to those stimuli had diminished by the time 2 effect. They've got back into much closer to the healthy range. So that was my cheerful thing, not related directly to aggression per se, but it made me cheerful when I saw the finding, as long as it stays solid as we carry on getting the numbers. Thanks very much.